The morning of June 4, 1942, aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi, began like every other combat morning in the 6 months since Pearl Harbor. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor itself, stood on the bridge observing preparations for what the Japanese Navy believed would be the decisive engagement of the Pacific War. The ship's deck crews worked with practiced efficiency, moving aircraft, refueling lines snaking across the wooden planks, ordnance carts delivering bombs and torpedoes to waiting planes. The air smelled of aviation fuel and salt spray. The carrier rolled gently in the swells, engines thrumming steadily below deck. At 10:22 in the morning, lookouts spotted aircraft diving from high altitude. Within 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers present at Midway would be transformed into burning wrecks. The Akagi, flagship of the carrier strike force, would be mortally wounded. The Kaga, veteran of every major operation since the war began, would be engulfed in flames from stem to stern. The Soryu, newest of the fleet carriers, would be ripped apart by internal explosions. The men aboard these ships, veterans of unbroken victory, confident in their equipment and their skills, experienced something they had never imagined possible. They were destroyed not in hours of prolonged combat, not in a lengthy engagement where both sides traded blows, but in 5 minutes of precision dive bombing that caught them at their most vulnerable moment. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The question that would haunt Japanese naval officers for the remainder of the war, the question that American naval historians would study for decades afterward, was not simply how this happened. The mechanics of dive bombing were well understood. American SPD Dauntless aircraft had dropped 1,000-pound bombs with sufficient accuracy to strike moving ships. The real question was psychological and strategic. How had the Japanese Navy, which 6 months earlier had executed the most successful carrier strike in naval history at Pearl Harbor, found itself in a position where 5 minutes could destroy the core of its striking power? How had a force that had swept Allied navies from the Western Pacific, that had sunk British battleships off Malaya and devastated the American battle line at Pearl Harbor, become so vulnerable that a handful of dive bomber pilots could effectively end Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific? The answer lay not in the 5 minutes themselves, but in the decisions, assumptions, and beliefs that had led the Japanese Navy to that moment. It lay in a doctrine of decisive battle that had shaped Japanese naval thinking for 40 years. It lay in a string of victories that had confirmed every assumption Japanese planners had made about their own capabilities and their enemies' weaknesses. It lay in the specific decisions made that morning aboard the Japanese carriers. Decisions that seemed entirely reasonable given what the Japanese knew, or thought they knew, about the situation they faced. To understand how 5 minutes at Midway could destroy 4 aircraft carriers and fundamentally alter the course of the Pacific War, we must first understand what the Japanese Navy believed about itself, about its equipment, about its enemy, and about the nature of naval warfare in the modern age. We must understand the foundation of confidence that had been built through careful planning, rigorous training, and repeated success. Only then can we grasp the magnitude of what happened in those 5 minutes, and why the psychological impact was as devastating as the material losses. The Japanese Navy that sailed toward Midway in June 1942 was not an untested force operating on theory and hope. It was a battle-hardened fleet that had achieved every objective set before it with methodical efficiency. In the 6 months since Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval forces had ranged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans in a campaign of conquest unprecedented in naval history. They had destroyed Allied naval power from Hawaii to Ceylon, capturing territory and resources across an area larger than the continental United States. The foundation of this success lay in carrier aviation. Japan had recognized earlier than most naval powers that the aircraft carrier would be the decisive weapon in Pacific warfare. While other nations still debated whether battleships or carriers should form the core of fleet strength, Japan had committed to carrier striking power as early as the 1920s. By 1941, the Japanese Navy possessed the finest carrier pilots in the world, men who had trained for thousands of hours and gained combat experience in China. These pilots could land on carrier decks in conditions that would aground American or British aviators. They could navigate across hundreds of miles of open ocean and strike targets with precision. They flew aircraft specifically designed for carrier operations, the Zero fighter and the Type 97 carrier attack plane, both superior to their Allied counterparts in range and maneuverability. The carriers themselves represented the culmination of Japanese naval engineering. The Akagi and Kaga were conversions from capital ships, modified and improved through the 1930s to become fast, capable carriers. The Soryu and Hiryu were purpose-built fleet carriers incorporating lessons learned from earlier designs. These ships could launch and recover aircraft quickly, could sustain operations across vast distances, and carried veteran deck crews who could rearm and refuel aircraft with remarkable speed. The entire system, from ship design to aircrew training to operational doctrine, had been refined through years of planning and practice. Pearl Harbor had validated this system spectacularly. On December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese carriers had launched 353 aircraft against the American Pacific Fleet's base in Hawaii. The attack had been executed with precision that shocked American observers. Japanese pilots had struck their assigned targets methodically, sinking or severely damaging 8 battleships, destroying 188 aircraft, killing 2,403 Americans. The Japanese had lost 29 aircraft and fewer than 100 men. It was the most one-sided naval victory in modern history, achieved through carrier aviation against a fortified naval base. But Pearl Harbor was only the beginning. In the weeks and months that followed, Japanese carrier forces demonstrated their capability across the Pacific. In January 1942, carriers supported the invasion of Rabaul, establishing a base that would dominate the South Pacific for years. In February, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Darwin, Australia, in a raid that destroyed shipping and facilities with the same efficiency demonstrated at Pearl Harbor. In April, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo led a carrier raid into the Indian Ocean that resulted in the sinking of the British carrier Hermes, 2 heavy cruisers, and numerous merchant ships. British Admiral Sir James Somerville, commanding the Eastern Fleet, withdrew to East Africa rather than face the Japanese carriers in open battle. The Indian Ocean, for practical purposes, became a Japanese lake. These victories were not accidental. They reflected a naval doctrine that had been developed and refined over decades. Japanese naval strategists had studied Admiral Togo's victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, and drawn specific lessons about the importance of decisive battle. They believed that modern naval warfare, like warfare throughout history, would be decided by a single climactic engagement between fleet forces. The side that could mass its strength and achieve surprise in that decisive battle would win the war. Everything in Japanese naval planning oriented toward preparing for this moment. The concept of decisive battle, what Japanese naval officers called Kantai Kessen, was not merely tactical preference. It was strategic necessity, born from Japan's geographic and industrial position. Japanese planners recognized that their nation could not sustain a prolonged war of attrition against the United States. American industrial capacity was roughly 10 times greater than Japan's. American access to raw materials, particularly oil and steel, dwarfed Japanese resources. In any extended conflict, these advantages would prove overwhelming. Japan's only path to victory lay in achieving decisive results quickly, forcing the Americans to accept a negotiated peace before their industrial might could be brought to bear fully. This strategic reality shaped every aspect of Japanese naval preparation. The fleet trained obsessively for the decisive engagement. Pilots practiced until their skills exceeded those of any other navy in the world. Gunnery crews drilled until they could fire with accuracy that American observers would later describe as uncanny. Night fighting techniques were developed to a degree unmatched by Western navies. Torpedo technology advanced to produce the Type 93 Long Lance, a weapon with greater range and destructive power than any comparable American or British torpedo. Every element of the fleet, from the newest destroyer to the most powerful battleship, was designed and trained to function in the decisive battle that would determine the war's outcome. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, understood this doctrine intimately. He had studied at Harvard, had served as naval attaché in Washington, and knew America's industrial potential better than most Japanese officers. He had opposed war with the United States, recognizing the long-term impossibility of Japanese victory. But once ordered to prepare for war, he had developed a strategy designed to give Japan its best chance: strike first, strike hard, and destroy enough of the American fleet that the United States would accept a negotiated settlement, rather than commit to years of costly warfare across the Pacific. Pearl Harbor had been the first step in this strategy. Midway was intended to be the culmination. By seizing Midway Island, Japan would eliminate the American base threatening Japanese-held Wake Island. More importantly, the operation would force the American carriers into a decisive engagement. American doctrine, Yamamoto reasoned, would require the U.S. Navy to defend Midway. When American carriers sortied to intercept the invasion force, Japanese carriers would be positioned to ambush and destroy them. With the American carrier force eliminated, with no naval aviation to oppose Japanese operations, the United States would be forced to accept Japanese dominance in the Western Pacific. The decisive battle would be won, and the war with it. This confidence was not baseless optimism. Every engagement since Pearl Harbor had confirmed Japanese assumptions. At the Battle of the Java Sea in late February 1942, Japanese cruisers and destroyers had destroyed an Allied naval force, attempting to stop the invasion of Java. In the Coral Sea in early May, Japanese and American carriers had fought the first engagement in naval history, where surface ships never made visual contact. Both sides had lost carriers, but the Japanese believed they had sunk 2 American carriers while losing only 1 light carrier themselves. The actual result was more balanced, with each side losing 1 carrier, but Japanese reports indicated a clear victory. From the Japanese perspective, the pattern continued. They attacked, they achieved their objectives, they inflicted greater losses than they suffered. By early June 1942, Japanese naval officers had every reason for confidence. Their carriers were veteran ships with experienced crews. Their pilots were the finest in the world. Their doctrine had been validated through 6 months of unbroken success. The operation planned for Midway was the most ambitious yet undertaken, involving multiple fleet elements coordinated across thousands of miles of ocean. But complexity did not concern them. They had executed equally complex operations successfully at Pearl Harbor and throughout the South Pacific. Admiral Nagumo, who would command the carrier striking force at Midway, had led every major carrier operation since the war began. His staff officers knew their jobs. His pilots trusted their equipment. His ships functioned with the efficiency that came from constant operations. Everything suggested that Midway would be another Japanese victory, perhaps the decisive one that would end effective American resistance in the Pacific. The Japanese carriers approached their launch point northwest of Midway in the pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942. Admiral Nagumo's orders were clear: launch a strike against Midway's airfield and installations to neutralize land-based aircraft that could threaten the invasion force. Hold a reserve strike force armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in case American carriers appeared. The Japanese did not expect American carriers to be present. Intelligence suggested the American fleet was still near Hawaii, too far away to interfere with the Midway operation. This intelligence was wrong, catastrophically wrong. But Nagumo had no way of knowing this, as his carriers turned into the wind to launch aircraft. At 4:30 in the morning, the first wave began taking off. 108 aircraft, a mixed formation of bombers and fighters, headed toward Midway. Lieutenant Chuichi Nagumo led the strike. He was an experienced pilot, veteran of multiple operations, and he knew his mission: suppress Midway's defenses, destroy aircraft on the ground, neutralize the island's ability to interfere with the invasion. Behind him, on the carrier's decks, 93 aircraft remained, the reserve strike force. These planes were armed for naval engagement, with torpedoes for the attack bombers and armor-piercing bombs for the dive bombers. If American ships appeared, Nagumo could launch immediately against them. What happened in the next several hours created the conditions for disaster. Midway's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike at a range of 93 miles. American aircraft launched to intercept. Marine fighters, mostly obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and a handful of Wildcats, met the Japanese formation. The combat was one-sided. Japanese Zeros shot down most of the Marine fighters with minimal losses. The Japanese strike proceeded to its target. Tomonaga's bombers struck Midway's installations, destroying fuel tanks, damaging the powerhouse, hitting buildings and aircraft. But the airfield remained operational. Crucially, American aircraft continued taking off during the attack. Tomonaga radioed back to Nagumo at 7 o'clock in the morning with a simple message. A second strike was necessary. This presented Nagumo with a decision. His reserve aircraft were armed for naval engagement. To conduct another strike on Midway, they would need to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs suitable for land targets. The process would take approximately an hour. Torpedoes would need to be removed. Bombs brought up from magazines. Aircraft respotted on the deck. During this time, the carriers would be vulnerable if American ships appeared, but Nagumo's intelligence still indicated no American carriers were nearby. At 7:15, he ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed for a second strike on Midway. The deck crews began their work. Torpedoes were removed from aircraft and returned to magazines below deck. High-explosive bombs were brought up and prepared for loading. The work proceeded methodically but created disorder on the carrier decks. Aircraft were moved to allow access to ordnance. Fuel lines remained connected to planes awaiting refueling. Bombs and torpedoes sat temporarily on the decks while crews worked. It was routine disorder, the normal chaos of carrier operations, nothing that concerned experienced deck officers. At 7:28, a Japanese scout plane radioed a report that would change everything. The pilot had spotted American ships. Nagumo immediately ordered the rearming stopped. If American carriers were present, he needed his torpedo bombers ready to attack them. At 7:45, the scout plane sent another message, confirming the presence of what appeared to be an American carrier. Nagumo now faced an impossible situation. His decks were cluttered with aircraft in various states of rearming. His first strike force was returning from Midway, low on fuel, needing to land immediately. American carrier aircraft were presumably inbound. He needed to clear his decks, recover his returning aircraft, rearm and refuel them, and launch a coordinated strike against the American carriers. The decision he made next was tactically sound given what he knew but would prove catastrophic in its consequences. Nagumo ordered his carriers to recover the Midway strike force first. This was Doctrine. Aircraft returning from a mission, low on fuel, took priority. Once they were aboard, once they were refueled and rearmed, he could launch a properly coordinated strike against the Americans with his full strength. The alternative, launching a hasty piecemeal attack with whatever aircraft were ready, violated Japanese doctrine and invited defeat in detail. So the carriers turned into the wind. Deck crews cleared landing areas. The first aircraft from Midway began touching down at 8:37. The recovery continued for the next hour and a half. During this time, the Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable, unable to launch strikes, decks cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines exposed, bombs and torpedoes stacked awaiting proper storage. Part 5. The American Approach. The American carriers that Nagumo's scout had spotted were Task Force 16 and Task Force 17, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher respectively. These forces included the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Yorktown had been damaged at Coral Sea and patched up in just 3 days at Pearl Harbor, work that would normally have taken 3 months. She was not fully repaired, but she was operational, and every carrier mattered. The Americans knew the Japanese were coming because they had broken Japanese naval codes. Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had decrypted enough Japanese communications to determine that a major operation was planned against Midway. The Americans had positioned their carriers northeast of Consilum. Midway, in a location to ambush the Japanese when they attacked the island. Fletcher, as senior officer, commanded the combined task force. At 6:03 in the morning, after receiving reports of the Japanese strike on Midway, he ordered Spruance to proceed southwest and attack the Japanese carriers, while Fletcher recovered scout aircraft from Yorktown. Spruance pushed his carriers forward at maximum speed. His staff calculated the Japanese carriers' probable position based on the reported course and speed of the aircraft that had struck Midway. At 7:02, Spruance made a crucial decision. He ordered his aircraft launched immediately, at extreme range, to catch the Japanese carriers while they were recovering their Midway strike force. This decision meant American aircraft would have barely enough fuel for the mission. They would be at the limit of their combat radius. Some might not make it back. But Spruance recognized the opportunity. If his strike caught the Japanese, the carriers, while they were landing aircraft, unable to launch fighters, the Americans might achieve devastating surprise. At 7:52, Enterprise began launching aircraft. Hornet followed minutes later. The American strike force consisted of 116 aircraft, every available bomber and torpedo plane from both carriers. The fighters stayed back to defend the carriers themselves, a decision that would prove costly for the attacking bombers, but reflected American doctrine prioritizing carrier defense. The American formations climbed away from their carriers, heading southwest toward where the Japanese should be. They flew individually by squadron rather than waiting to form a coordinated strike group. This meant they would attack piecemeal, torpedo bombers and dive bombers arriving separately rather than simultaneously. But it also meant they would arrive sooner, catching the Japanese during the recovery and rearming process. What followed was a series of American attacks that appeared to validate every Japanese assumption about American naval aviation. Starting at 9:30, torpedo bombers from Hornet located the Japanese carriers and pressed home their attacks with suicidal courage. They came in low, slow, vulnerable, without fighter escort. Japanese Zeros and anti-aircraft fire destroyed them systematically. Of 15 torpedo bombers from Hornet's VT-8 squadron, only one pilot survived. Torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown met similar fates. The torpedoes they managed to launch were ineffective, running too deep or failing to detonate. Not a single American torpedo hit a Japanese carrier that morning. 41 torpedo bombers attacked, 35 were shot down, 0 hits achieved. From the Japanese perspective, this confirmed their superiority in combat efficiency and equipment quality. But the torpedo attacks accomplished something the Americans could not have deliberately planned. They drew down the Japanese combat air patrol. The Zeros defending the carriers descended to wave-top altitude to intercept the torpedo bombers. Japanese attention focused on the immediate, visible threat at sea level. Nobody was watching the sky at 14,000 feet, where American dive bombers were approaching. At 10:22 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber group, spotted the Japanese carriers. He had been searching for over an hour, fuel running critically low, about to turn back when he noticed a Japanese destroyer moving at high speed. He followed its wake and found the carriers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Below him, McCluskey saw all 4 Japanese carriers. They were in the process of launching their strike against the American carriers. Aircraft were spotted on decks, engines running, fuel lines still connected. Bombs and torpedoes were visible on the decks awaiting final loading. It was the perfect target. Carriers at their most vulnerable moment. Decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. No fighters at altitude to interfere with the attack. McCluskey pushed over into his dive at 10:22. 37 dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown followed him down. The first bomb struck Akagi at 10:26 in the morning. The explosion tore through the flight deck near the amidships elevator. The bomb, a 1,000-pound armor-piercing weapon designed to penetrate battleship decks, went through the wooden flight deck and exploded in the hangar deck below. The hangar was full of aircraft, some being refueled, some being rearmed, all packed closely together. Aviation fuel lines were exposed. Torpedoes and bombs were stacked waiting to be loaded. The explosion ignited fuel vapor. Fire spread instantly through the hangar. A second bomb hit moments later, striking near the aft elevator, creating another massive explosion in the hangar space. The fires reached stored ordnance. Bombs began exploding. Torpedoes detonated. The entire stern of the ship became an inferno. On Akagi's bridge, Commander Fuchida, who had been wounded in the leg during an American attack earlier that morning, watched in disbelief as his ship was transformed into a flaming wreck in seconds. He had been on this deck when Akagi launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had watched Japanese precision destroy the American battle line. Now, he watched American precision destroy his ship. The fires spread forward through the hangar. Fueled aircraft on the flight deck began burning. Men trapped below decks screamed as fire and smoke consumed the hangar spaces. Damage control parties attempted to fight the fires but were driven back by intense heat and secondary explosions. The ship's fire mains had been damaged by the bomb hits. Water pressure failed. There was no way to control the fires spreading through the ship. Cargo was hit simultaneously. 3 bombs struck in rapid succession. The first hit forward on the flight deck, penetrating to the hangar and igniting aircraft and fuel. The second struck amidships, destroying the bridge and killing most of the senior officers instantly. The third hit aft, creating another massive explosion in the hangar deck. Like Akagi, Kaga's hangar was full of armed and fueled aircraft. The bombs started fires that spread through the ship with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the entire hangar deck was burning. Explosions ripped through the ship as stored ammunition detonated. The forward elevator was blown completely off the ship by an internal explosion. The massive steel platform thrown hundreds of feet into the air before crashing into the sea. Soryu was the third carrier hit. 3 bombs struck between 10:25 and 10:27. The bombs came from Yorktown's VB-3 squadron, which had approached from a different direction than Enterprise's aircraft. The Soryu's deck was crowded with aircraft preparing to launch. The first bomb hit near the forward elevator, penetrating to the hangar and exploding among parked aircraft. The second hit amidships on the flight deck, its explosion igniting fuel and ammunition. The third struck aft. Within moments, Soryu was burning along her entire length. The fires reached the torpedo storage spaces. Torpedoes began detonating, each explosion tearing apart more of the ship's internal structure. The carrier became a floating volcano, flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air, smoke visible for 50 miles. The attacks lasted 5 minutes. American dive bomber pilots, pulling out of their dives, looked back to see all 3 carriers burning. Some pilots later reported that they initially thought they were looking at one carrier hit multiple times until they realized there were 3 separate fires, 3 carriers destroyed. The scene was almost incomprehensible in its totality. The core of the totality, Japanese carrier striking force. The ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had ranged across the Pacific in 6 months of unbroken victory, were burning wrecks. The aircrews that would have launched Japan's counterstrike were dead or dying in the flames. The aircraft that would have attacked the American carriers were exploding on the hangar decks. The mechanics, the armorers, the experienced deck crews who made carrier operations possible, were trapped below decks in spaces filling with fire and toxic smoke. On Hiryu, the only Japanese carrier not yet hit, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi watched the disaster unfold. His carrier was separated from the others by several miles. American dive bombers had not spotted her during their initial attack. Yamaguchi immediately ordered his aircraft launched against the Americans. He would strike back with everything he had. But he was launching fewer than 20 aircraft, all that remained ready from the reserve that had been held back. Against 3 American carriers with full combat air patrols and anti-aircraft defenses, it was a desperate gesture. The Japanese had planned to launch over 100 aircraft in a coordinated strike. Now they were sending fewer than 20. The fires aboard Akagi, Kaga and Soryu burned with intensity that defeated every effort to control them. On Akagi, Admiral Nagumo remained on the bridge as long as possible, watching his flagship die around him. Damage control parties fought desperately to contain the fires, but the situation was hopeless. The bomb hits had destroyed fire mains and ruptured fuel lines. Aviation gasoline fed the flames. Each new explosion spread fire to areas not yet burning. By 11 o'clock in the morning, less than an hour after the bombs hit, the entire ship was engulfed. The heat became unbearable on the bridge. Steel bulkheads glowed red. Paint blistered and ignited spontaneously. Nagumo's staff urged him to transfer his flag to a destroyer. He refused at first, unwilling to abandon his ship while men were still fighting below. Finally, at 10:46, with the bridge itself beginning to burn, Nagumo climbed down to a waiting boat. He transferred to the light cruiser Nagara and watched Akagi burn from a distance of several miles. The scenes aboard the dying carriers were nightmarish. Men trapped below decks by spreading fires faced choices no human should face. Some attempted to reach topside through passages filling with smoke. Others, cut off by flames, gathered in compartments that became ovens as the fires approached. The heat was so intense that steel bulkheads transmitted it to adjacent spaces, killing men through radiant heat before flames actually reached them. Survivors who made it to the flight deck found themselves on islands of steel surrounded by fire. Some jumped into the sea, swimming away from their burning ships. Others remained aboard, helping wounded shipmates or continuing to fight fires in areas not yet consumed. The discipline that had made the Japanese Navy feared throughout the Pacific remained intact, even as the ships died. Kaga burned even more intensely than Akagi. The bomb that had destroyed her bridge killed her captain and most senior officers immediately. The surviving officers had no communication with most of the ship. Fires isolated different sections. Men fought independently, without coordination, some not even knowing the extent of the damage. In the engine rooms far below, engineering crews maintained power and steam pressure, even as temperatures rose to unbearable levels. They knew the ship was dying, but they kept the engines running so pumps could deliver water to firefighting teams. Many of these men never made it out. They remained at their posts until heat and smoke overcame them. When Kaga was finally abandoned late in the afternoon, hundreds of men were still trapped below. The ship was so hot that paint on nearby destroyers blistered from the radiant heat when they approached to pick up survivors. Soryu died fastest of the 3 carriers hit in the initial attack. The torpedo explosions in her storage spaces broke her back structurally. The ship began settling rapidly by the bow. Her captain, Ryusaku Yamamoto, ordered the ship abandoned at 10:45, only 18 minutes after the first bomb hit. Crew members begged him to leave. He refused, choosing to go down with his ship. He remained on the bridge as Soryu's bow submerged. The carrier slipped beneath the waves at 7:13 in the evening, taking Captain Yamamoto and hundreds of crew members with her. She was the first of the 3 carriers to sink. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, continued operations while her sister ships burned. Admiral Yamaguchi launched 2 small strikes against the American carriers during the afternoon. His aircraft found Yorktown and hit her with bombs and torpedoes. The American carrier was severely damaged and would eventually be sunk by a Japanese submarine while under tow. But Yorktown's sacrifice bought time for Enterprise and Hornet to locate Hiryu. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise found the Japanese carrier. They attacked from high altitude, achieving complete surprise. 4 bombs hit Hiryu in rapid succession. The carrier suffered the same fate as her sisters. Fires spread through the hangar deck. Explosions destroyed damage control capability. By evening, Hiryu was a burning hulk, drifting dead in the water. Admiral Yamaguchi refused evacuation. He chose to die with his ship, as did Hiryu's captain. The carrier sank early on the morning of June 5. In less than 24 hours, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, the core of its naval striking power. But the material losses, as catastrophic as they were, did not fully represent the disaster. Japan had lost over 300 aircraft, bombers and fighters that could not be quickly replaced. More critically, Japan had lost the aircrews, the mechanics, the armorers, the experienced deck personnel who made carrier operations possible. These men represented years of training, combat experience that could not be transmitted through instruction. a pilot who had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had flown combat missions across the Pacific, who knew how to land on a carrier deck at night in rough seas, was irreplaceable. Japan could build new carriers, given time and resources. Japan could manufacture new aircraft. But Japan could not recreate the institutional knowledge and combat experience that died in the fires at Midway. The survivors brought back to Japan in the weeks after Midway carried with them something more dangerous than physical wounds. They carried the knowledge that the war could be lost. Japanese naval officers who had believed in inevitable victory, who had trained their entire careers for the decisive battle that would confirm Japan's dominance, had witnessed the decisive battle go catastrophically wrong. The Americans had not fought according to Japanese expectations. American dive bombers had achieved a level of precision Japanese planners had not credited to American pilots. American intelligence had positioned carriers exactly where they needed to be, suggesting the Americans had better information than Japanese security had considered possible. American industrial capacity, already recognized as superior, now appeared even more formidable given how quickly the damaged Yorktown had been returned to service. The Japanese Navy attempted to suppress information about the magnitude of the defeat. Officers and enlisted men returning from Midway were ordered not to discuss what had happened. They were dispersed to different units and bases to prevent them from forming groups that might spread demoralization. Official reports minimized losses and emphasized the damage inflicted on American forces. The Japanese public was told that Midway had been a victory, that American carriers had been sunk, that Japanese forces had achieved their objectives. But within the Navy itself, the truth could not be hidden. Too many ships had not returned. Too many experienced officers and men were dead. The 4 carriers that had formed the core of Japanese striking power since Pearl Harbor were gone, and everyone in the naval service knew it. The psychological impact extended beyond simple knowledge of defeat. The speed of the disaster shattered assumptions about Japanese superiority in combat efficiency. 5 minutes had been sufficient to destroy 3 carriers. The coordination required for American dive bombers from 2 different carriers to attack simultaneously suggested a level of operational capability Japanese planners had not attributed to the Americans. The fact that this had happened while Japanese fighters were overhead, while the carriers were preparing their own strike, while everything seemed under control, demonstrated that American forces could exploit moments of vulnerability with devastating effectiveness. The Japanese Navy had planned for the decisive battle. They had not planned to lose it so quickly, so completely, so irreversibly. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from the battleship Yamato several hundred miles behind the carriers, received reports of the disaster with growing dismay. He had gambled on Midway, bringing about the decisive battle that would destroy American carrier power. Instead, he had lost his own carriers, while the Americans retained 2 operational carriers and would soon bring more into service. Yamamoto considered bringing his battleships forward to engage the American carriers in a night surface action, but his staff convinced him the risk was too great. The Americans could avoid battle, and even if engaged, modern carriers could launch strikes against battleships at ranges where the battleship's guns were useless. Yamamoto ordered the entire operation cancelled. Japanese forces withdrew from Midway without attempting the planned invasion. The operation, designed to extend Japan's defensive perimeter and destroy American naval power, had accomplished neither objective. The strategic implications became clear in the months following Midway. Japan could no longer conduct offensive operations on the scale achieved in the war's first 6 months. The loss of 4 carriers meant that Japanese naval aviation could no longer dominate large areas of ocean. American forces, recognizing the shift in the balance of power, began limited offensive operations. In August 1942, Marines landed on Guadalcanal, beginning a 6-month campaign that would further deplete Japanese naval and air strength. Japan had new carriers under construction, but they would not be ready for more than a year. The Shokaku and Zuikaku, 2 fleet carriers that had not been present at Midway, could not by themselves provide the striking power that 4 carriers had offered. Japanese naval strategy after Midway became increasingly defensive. Rather than seeking the decisive battle on terms favorable to Japan, the Navy found itself responding to American initiatives. Each engagement depleted irreplaceable resources. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, Japanese carriers damaged the Enterprise but lost aircraft and pilots they could not replace. At the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October, the carrier Hornet was sunk, but Japanese aircraft losses were so severe that their carriers had to withdraw from the area. By the end of 1942, Japan had won tactical victories but lost the strategic initiative. The confidence that had characterized Japanese naval operations in the war's first 6 months was gone, replaced by grim awareness that the war was becoming one of attrition, the type of war Japan could not win. The story of what happened after Midway is the story of inevitable decline. Japan continued fighting. For more than 3 years after June 4, 1942, Japanese forces won battles, achieved local successes, and demonstrated tactical skill and courage that commanded respect even from their enemies. But the trajectory established at Midway never changed. Japan was losing, slowly but inexorably, to an enemy with greater resources, greater industrial capacity, and growing combat effectiveness. The decisive battle doctrine that had shaped Japanese naval strategy for 40 years had been tested at Midway and found catastrophically inadequate for modern industrial warfare. The carriers lost at Midway were eventually replaced, but never adequately. The Taiho, launched in 1943, was a modern fleet carrier, incorporating lessons learned from combat experience. She was sunk by an American submarine on her first operation in June 1944. The Shinano, converted from a battleship hull, was the largest carrier built during World War II. She was sunk by a Marine 10 days after being commissioned, before carrying out a single combat operation. Japan built carriers, but American submarines sank them faster than Japanese industry could replace them. By 1945, Japan had no operational carriers capable of conducting offensive missions. The Naval Air Service that had been the finest in the world in December 1941 existed only as a shadow of its former capability, reduced to kamikaze attacks because trained pilots no longer existed in sufficient numbers for conventional operations. The institutional knowledge lost at Midway could never be recovered. The mechanics who could repair aircraft under combat conditions, the armorers who could load ordnance efficiently, the deck officers who understood the complex choreography of carrier operations, all these men died in the fires at Midway or in subsequent battles. Japan trained replacements, but these new men lacked combat experience. Their errors in judgment, their slower response times, their lack of instinctive understanding of carrier warfare, all contributed to declining effectiveness. By late 1943, American carriers could conduct operations at night with greater efficiency than Japanese carriers could manage during daylight. The capability gap that had favored Japan at the war's beginning had reversed completely. The psychological impact of Midway extended beyond the Navy to Japanese strategic thinking generally. If the decisive battle had been lost at Midway, what strategy remained? Japanese planners developed increasingly desperate schemes. They fortified island garrisons, creating defensive positions designed to inflict maximum casualties on American forces, in hopes that casualty rates would erode American willingness to continue the war. They developed kamikaze tactics, accepting pilot deaths as the cost of achieving damage to American ships. They prepared for the decisive battle for the homeland, committing remaining resources to defending Japan itself. None of these strategies addressed the fundamental problem Midway had revealed. Japan could not win a prolonged war of attrition against the United States. Every month, the war continued. American industrial and military strength grew while Japanese strength declined. The 5 minutes at 10:22 in the morning on June 4, 1942, did not determine the Pacific War's outcome by themselves. But they revealed the outcome with pitiless clarity. They demonstrated that Japanese confidence, built on early victories against surprised or unprepared opponents, was not justified when facing an enemy with superior resources and comparable tactical skill. They showed that carrier warfare could produce decisive results with frightening speed when the circumstances aligned properly. They proved that intelligence and positioning could be more important than numerical equality or slight superiority. Most fundamentally, they revealed that the decisive battle Japan had planned for, trained for, and based its entire strategy upon, could be lost as easily as won, and losing it meant losing the war. For the men who died at Midway, aboard Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, their sacrifice was not meaningless, but it was futile. They had trained for years to fight the decisive battle. They had achieved victory after victory in the war's opening months. They had believed in their equipment, their doctrine, and their superiority. They died in fires and explosions, trapped in sinking ships, or swimming in an ocean that offered no rescue. They had done everything their navy had asked of them. Their navy had promised them that superior training, courage, and fighting spirit would overcome any material disadvantage. Midway proved that promise was false. In modern industrial warfare, material advantage combined with adequate tactical skill defeats superior training combined with material disadvantage. The mathematics are brutal, unforgiving. The Americans who flew the dive bombers that destroyed the Japanese carriers understood what they had achieved. But many did not survive to see the war's end. Wade McCluskey, who led Enterprise's dive bombers to their target, was wounded by anti-aircraft fire during his attack. He survived Midway and the war, retiring as a rear admiral. Richard Best, who personally hit both Akagi and Hiryu with 1,000-pound bombs, breathed caustic soda fumes from a faulty oxygen system during his dive. The fumes permanently damaged his lungs. He was medically retired from active duty and never flew combat again. He lived until 2001, long enough to see historians recognize his contribution as perhaps the most significant by any individual pilot at Midway. Many others were not as fortunate. They died in subsequent battles, or in accidents, or from wounds received at Midway. Their contribution to victory was absolute, but their personal cost was high. The lesson of Midway, the lesson those 5 minutes at 10:22 taught to anyone willing to learn, is that modern warfare between industrial powers is decided by resources, production capacity, and strategic depth as much as by courage or tactical skill. The Japanese Navy that approached Midway in June 1942 was confident because it had won every engagement it had fought. That confidence was shattered in 5 minutes of American dive bombing that revealed the true balance of power in the Pacific. Japan had challenged the world's greatest industrial power to a war of attrition. At Midway, the outcome of that challenge became visible. Everything that followed was aftermath. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.